Sometimes the person you take a bullet for is standing behind the trigger. Mark and Lisa had been married for 21 years, sharing a life together in Texas. Mark ran a successful vending machine business he built from scratch, enjoying a stable income and lifestyle. Their life was comfortable, and though they faced their share of challenges, it was a life he thought they had both worked hard to protect. One of their biggest challenges had been fertility. Over the years, they had gone through multiple rounds of IVF, hoping to have children. Each round was an emotional roller coaster, filled with the ups and downs of hope and disappointment. But after years of trying, they finally accepted that parenthood just wasn't in the cards for them. They leaned on each other through the experience, or at least, Mark believed they did. They shared their pain, and he felt they came out stronger for it. But recently, things had begun to feel off. Lisa started talking more often about an old friend she'd reconnected with. She'd mention him casually here and there, dropping his name in conversations, bringing up stories about their past. Mark brushed it off at first. After all, everyone has friends. But the frequency of these mentions kept increasing. The old friend became a constant in her stories, and Mark began to feel a hint of unease. Then came the late nights. Lisa, who normally was home by dinner, started working later than usual. She'd text him to say she was busy with work, running late, or out with coworkers. This wasn't like her. She'd always been someone who valued their evenings together, and she rarely used to work late. It wasn't in her nature, but Mark didn't want to jump to conclusions. One particular night stuck with him. Lisa had texted that she'd be home late due to work. Mark stayed up, waiting for her, watching the clock as the hours ticked by. Midnight came and went, and still no word from Lisa. He tried calling her, but his calls went unanswered. Finally, sometime in the early hours, she walked in, looking tired and avoiding eye contact. She offered a quick explanation, saying she'd been at a friend's house with some male coworkers. When he asked why she hadn't called or texted to let him know, Lisa brushed off his concerns, saying he was making too much of it. Mark wanted to believe her, but seeing her come home at those hours, looking exhausted, felt wrong. She apologized the next day, looking remorseful, but even that felt hollow. This one late night started a pattern of behavior that was impossible for him to ignore. Not long after, Lisa brought up a topic that surprised him. She mentioned wanting to explore new things in their marriage. She said this as they sat over coffee one morning, almost casually suggesting the idea of a threesome. Mark was taken aback. This was nothing like the Lisa he knew. She'd never brought up anything like this in the past, and the suggestion felt out of character. It felt like it came out of nowhere, and it left him with more questions than answers. As time passed, the strange behavior only continued. Lisa began guarding her phone more carefully, always keeping it locked with a password. Mark would catch glimpses of her texting someone, her face lit by the phone's glow, but she never shared who she was speaking to. She was always quick to brush it off, and Mark held back from pressing her, not wanting to come off as controlling, but seeing her acting like this added to his growing discomfort. Eventually, the signs were too strong to ignore. Mark felt he had to know the truth. This wasn't the relationship he'd known for 21 years, and he couldn't stay in the dark any longer. He made the difficult decision to hire a private investigator, hoping to find clarity. He needed to know if his suspicions were valid or if he was simply imagining things. The answer, when it came, would confirm everything he feared. After that late night, Lisa's behavior didn't improve. In fact, her actions became more suspicious. She'd always been open with Mark, but now it felt like she was building walls. When she was home, she was glued to her phone, always texting or scrolling, but she never shared who she was talking to. She'd laugh softly or type away, and when Mark was around, she'd quickly put her phone down or turn it over. Mark started noticing small but telling signs. For one, Lisa's phone was always on silent. She'd once been someone who kept the sound on, her ringtone familiar in their quiet home. Now it seemed like she didn't want him to know when a message came through. The password was another thing. They'd shared each other's phone codes in the past, but now hers was locked tight, and when he jokingly asked for the new one, she'd deflect or change the subject. Her excuses for being away increased too. Work meetings, Catching up with old friends and girls' nights started popping up on her schedule more than ever. Whenever Mark asked if he could join or meet her friends, she'd insist it was just a work thing or that he wouldn't know anyone there. It didn't feel right, but he didn't want to start a fight. He thought he'd be able to tell if something serious was going on. Yet, here he was, feeling like he was standing outside, looking in on his own marriage. One evening, Lisa went out for another work dinner, dressed a bit more carefully than usual. She put on her favorite perfume and spent extra time in front of the mirror, fixing her hair and makeup. Mark watched her leave, waving from the door, trying to dismiss the discomfort in his gut. He waited up again that night, but like before, she came home after midnight, gave him a quick kiss, and went straight to bed without much of a word. Mark's trust was tested even more when he noticed that Lisa's habits continued outside of their home. They always had open conversations about money, but now she started paying for more things in cash, something she'd never done before. It was small, but it added to the list of things that didn't make sense. He felt lost, questioning if he was just imagining things or if his wife was actually hiding something. One day, while she was out, Mark saw a text notification flash on her phone from an unknown number. The message was short but stood out. "Can't wait to see you." That was all it took for him to feel a wave of suspicion. He tried to shake it off, but the message stuck with him. In the following weeks, Mark noticed that Lisa would always have her phone with her, even keeping it close when they were at home together. She'd text late into the night and sometimes head to the bathroom to continue her conversations in private. He couldn't ignore the signs any longer. The distance between them was widening, and he didn't know how to bridge it. Finally, he felt he had to address it. Mark brought up his concerns one evening, gently asking about the frequent absences, the phone habits, and the secrecy. Lisa listened but rushed off his questions, insisting he was being paranoid and overthinking things. She said that work had been stressful, that she was just venting to friends, and that there was nothing to worry about. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Each time he tried to trust her explanations, another strange behavior or another late night would bring his doubts back. He was losing sleep, worrying about the woman he thought he knew. He was at a crossroads. He wanted to trust her, but also needed the truth. With the pieces of the puzzle coming together, Mark made the difficult decision to get outside help to confirm if his fears were real. He hired a private investigator, hoping to finally get answers to the questions that had been haunting him. The investigator's findings would reveal the reality of his marriage and shatter the life he thought he knew. One Friday evening, Mark was at home waiting for Lisa, who'd once again texted to say she'd be late. It was the third time that week she'd said she had a work commitment or a meetup with friends, and he was starting to lose patience. But this time, he decided not to wait up. He left her a text saying he hoped she'd be home soon and went to bed, hoping to get a decent night's sleep. Around 2 a.m, Mark woke up to find that her side of the bed was still empty. The silence in the house felt heavy, and the worry that had become his constant companion settled in his chest again. He checked his phone. No texts, no missed calls. It was unusual. Even on her late nights, she'd text him to say she was on her way, but tonight, there was nothing. Unable to sleep, Mark got up and went to the living room, staring out the window and waiting for the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. Minutes felt like hours as he tried to calm himself, but every minute she was gone just added to his unease. Finally, he heard the familiar sound of her car, followed by the soft click of the door as she came in. Lisa entered, trying to be quiet. She seemed surprised to see him awake, her face flushed, and her hair a bit messier than usual. Mark asked her where she'd been. Her response was vague. She'd just been out with coworkers, blowing off steam. She quickly apologized and said she'd had a little too much to drink, brushing off the late hour as if it were no big deal. Mark tried to accept her explanation, but something about her body language didn't sit right. She seemed distant, avoiding eye contact, and when he pressed for details, her answers became defensive. She seemed irritated that he was questioning her, telling him he was being overly suspicious. Then, as she headed toward the bedroom, she dropped a new revelation. She thought maybe they could spice things up in their relationship. She mentioned the idea of exploring new things, including the possibility of a threesome. Mark was stunned. They'd never discussed anything like this before, and the suggestion seemed completely out of character for her. He didn't know what to make of it. Part of him wanted to believe she was just trying to make their marriage more exciting. But another part of him couldn't ignore the possibility that her new idea was a cover for something else. He asked her outright if there was someone else. Lisa denied it, laughing off the suggestion, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that her words were hiding something. The next morning, after Lisa had left for work, Mark found himself thinking about her suggestion again. He wondered if there was any truth behind it or if it was an attempt to disguise a deeper issue. That was when he noticed Lisa's phone charging on the kitchen counter. She rarely left it unattended, but in her hurry, she must have forgotten to bring it with her. Mark hesitated, feeling guilty even thinking about looking through it, but his curiosity got the better of him. With trembling hands, he picked up her phone, hoping to find some kind of answer. But it was locked, and her password had been changed. He couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment and frustration, another barrier keeping him from the truth. That was when he decided he couldn't ignore his suspicions any longer. He needed clarity, and he knew he wouldn't get it by just hoping for the best. After thinking about it for the rest of the day, he took a step he never thought he'd take. He reached out to a private investigator. The investigator was a quiet, professional man who had seen cases like Mark's before. He didn't offer any false hope, just assured Mark that he'd do his job discreetly and gather the information Mark needed. It was a strange feeling, trusting someone else to uncover the truth of his own marriage, but Mark felt it was his only option. Days turned into weeks as Mark waited for updates. Every time Lisa went out or received a late-night text, he found himself wondering if this was the night he'd finally get answers. The investigator stayed in touch, giving Mark occasional updates, but nothing definitive. He was growing impatient, feeling like his life was in a constant state of suspense. Then, one afternoon, the investigator called. He had something he needed to show Mark. They arranged to meet at a small, discreet cafe, far from where anyone might recognize him. Mark arrived early, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The investigator walked in and greeted him with a nod, sliding an envelope across the table. Inside were photos, text, and records of Lisa's whereabouts. Mark's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, each one revealing a truth he hadn't wanted to face. The picture showed Lisa with another man, their faces close, laughing together in ways that once had been reserved for him. There was one photo of them standing near her car, locked in an embrace, lips touching. As he stared at the evidence, Mark felt a wave of betrayal wash over him. The woman he'd shared his life with, his dreams, and his struggles were keeping secrets and sharing moments with someone else. The text showed conversations that were even more difficult to read, words of affection and hidden plans that Lisa had kept from him. He saw her arranging meetups, sharing private jokes, and even calling this other man by terms of endearment. Mark sat there, feeling his world collapse around him. Every moment, every memory they'd shared felt like it was slipping away, replaced by the harsh reality of her betrayal. The investigator stayed quiet, allowing him the space to process everything. Finally, Mark spoke, his voice low and heavy. He thanked the investigator, slipping the envelope into his bag. He knew he had a lot to think about, a lot to decide, but he didn't have the words to express the storm of emotions churning inside him. That night, he didn't confront Lisa. Instead, he took the time to absorb what he'd learned. He realized that his marriage, the foundation he thought was solid, had been crumbling beneath him, piece by piece, and he didn't know if he could forgive or even if he wanted to try. In the following days, Mark moved with a newfound clarity. He knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. The evidence was in front of him, undeniable and painful. He decided to begin the process of separation, reaching out to a lawyer to discuss his options. The betrayal cut deep, but for the first time in weeks, Mark felt a sense of relief. He'd uncovered the truth, painful as it was, and now he could begin to think about moving forward. He packed a bag and moved in with his brother, seeking a place to start healing. Lisa, of course, noticed his absence, but Mark didn't rush to give her explanations. He let her wonder, just as he'd spent nights wondering where she was and what she was hiding. It was his way of taking back control, of reclaiming his dignity. In time, Mark would have to face Lisa and the hard conversations that awaited. But for now, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the truth, knowing that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with a clearer mind and an understanding of what he deserved. After that strange night when Lisa came home late, looking disheveled and avoiding eye contact, Mark's unease only grew. He wanted to believe her explanation, to trust that she'd just been out with coworkers. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He tried to push his suspicions aside. But as the days went by, more signs began to appear, little clues that made him question everything he thought he knew about his wife. It started with her phone. Lisa had always been relaxed about leaving her phone around the house, sometimes even asking Mark to answer it if she was busy. But now she seemed to guard it closely. She'd keep it with her at all times, even carrying it to the bathroom or hiding it under her pillow at night. It wasn't just her phone's sudden presence in her hand all the time. It was also that her phone was now locked with a password he didn't know. They had always been open with each other, never needing to hide anything. So why was she being so secretive now? Mark tried to brush it off, telling himself that maybe she was just going through a phase, or that it had something to do with work. But then she started keeping her phone on silent, something she'd never done before. He'd catch her smiling at her screen or typing quickly, her fingers moving with a certain urgency that didn't seem to fit with simple work texts. When he'd ask who she was talking to, she'd just say, "Oh, just a friend," and change the subject. As time went on, he noticed she'd often go outside to take calls, something that had never been part of their routine. Mark started to wonder why she couldn't just answer her phone inside the house. Why was she stepping out for calls that used to be so open? Each time he saw her walk out with her phone in hand, he felt another crack in the trust he'd built with her over the years. He wanted to believe she was telling the truth, but the growing distance between them made it hard. One evening, Mark decided to confront her gently. As they sat down for dinner, he brought it up, saying he'd noticed she was spending a lot more time on her phone and had been going out more often. Lisa looked at him, surprised, and brushed it off, saying he was reading too much into things. She claimed she was just stressed from work and needed space to clear her head. Her explanation felt thin, but Mark wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. He knew that every marriage had its ups and downs, and maybe this was just a rough patch. But over the next few weeks, things didn't improve. If anything, the distance between them seemed to widen. Lisa would come home later than usual, with new reasons each time. Sometimes she'd say she was meeting old friends. Other times it was a work dinner or an event he wouldn't enjoy. He found himself sitting alone, waiting up for her, his mind racing with questions. Each time she walked through the door, he tried to look for answers in her face, in her body language, hoping to see some sign of the woman he thought he knew. But all he saw were more walls being built between them. One night, she came home particularly late. She was a little tipsy, and as they talked, she let something slip, a mention of a new friend from work, someone she had been spending time with. She spoke about him casually, but Mark couldn't ignore the way she mentioned this man. There was a tone, a slight shift in her voice that felt different. She said they'd been talking about trying new things and exploring life outside the routine. Then, as if testing the waters, she brought up the idea of a threesome, something they had never discussed in all their years together. Mark was caught off guard. This suggestion didn't fit with the Lisa he knew. He tried to laugh it off, assuming it was just an odd joke, but the look on her face suggested otherwise. She seemed to genuinely want him to consider it, like it was something she'd been thinking about for a while. The suggestion lingered in his mind long after she'd gone to bed, leaving him awake, questioning if there was more behind her words. In the following days, her behavior only became more suspicious. Mark noticed her making plans without telling him the details, slipping out with vague excuses. There was a shift in her energy, a distance that made him feel like he was sharing a home with a stranger. He wanted to confront her again, to ask if there was something she wasn't telling him. But a part of him was afraid of the answer. He didn't want to believe that his wife could be hiding something so serious from him. Then came the day he saw a message flash across her screen, just briefly enough to catch his attention. It was from a number he didn't recognize, and the words were simple but alarming. "Can't wait to see you again." The message stirred something in him, a mixture of fear and anger. He tried to ignore the signs, tried to give her space, but now he felt like he couldn't keep lying to himself. Mark started watching for more clues, small things he could piece together to understand what was happening. He noticed she started using cash for certain expenses, something she hadn't done before. They'd always been open about their finances, tracking their spending together, but now she seemed to be keeping things separate, making purchases he couldn't account for. It felt like she was intentionally creating distance, hiding pieces of her life from him. One weekend, when Lisa said she was going out with friends, Mark felt an overwhelming urge to check her phone. He'd never invaded her privacy before, but the growing mistrust was eating away at him. He waited until she left, then searched for her phone, only to find it locked. She changed the password again. The realization hit him hard, adding another layer to his suspicions. She was keeping secrets from him, and he couldn't deny it any longer. The distance between them became almost unbearable. Nights that were once filled with laughter and shared stories now felt heavy with silence. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was as if they were strangers trying to hold a conversation. He could feel her slipping away, but he didn't know how to reach her, how to break down the walls she put up. In a moment of desperation, Mark reached out to a close friend. He confided in him, sharing his suspicions and the changes he noticed. His friend listened, offering a sympathetic ear and gentle advice. He suggested that Mark consider seeking professional help, maybe even counseling, to try and address what was happening. But deep down, Mark felt that it was too late. The trust that had once been the foundation of their marriage was eroding, slipping through his fingers. Finally, after weeks of living with the tension, he made a difficult decision. He needed clarity, a sense of closure that he knew Lisa wouldn't give him. Mark decided to hire a private investigator, hoping that an outside perspective could help him understand the truth. It was a decision that tore at him, but he felt he had no other choice. He needed answers, even if they confirmed his worst fears. The investigator agreed to take the case, and Mark felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with dread. For the first time in months, he felt like he was moving toward the truth. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might find, but he knew he couldn't live with the doubt any longer. He couldn't keep pretending everything was okay while his marriage crumbled before his eyes. The investigator's findings would ultimately reveal the secrets Lisa had been hiding, shattering the illusion that Mark had held on to for so long. But until then, he waited, caught between hope and heartbreak, as he prepared himself for the answers he desperately needed. The wait felt like a lifetime. Each day, Mark went through the motions, pretending everything was normal, but his mind was consumed with what the investigator might find. The doubts, the late nights, the guarded phone, it all played over and over in his head. The silence in his apartment felt heavier than ever, pressing down on him as he waited for answers. Part of him hoped that he'd been wrong, that the investigator would come back with nothing but innocent explanations. But another part of him knew he had to face the truth, whatever it was. After waiting for a week, Mark got the call. The investigator had found something and wanted to meet in person to go over the details. The drive to the small, quiet cafe where they'd agreed to meet felt surreal. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his heart pounding as he tried to prepare himself. He'd always thought of himself as a strong person, someone who could handle anything. But now, he wasn't so sure. When he arrived, the investigator was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a folder on the table in front of him. Mark slid into the seat across from him, and the investigator nodded, greeting him with a somber look. He didn't waste any time. Without a word, he slid the folder across the table. Inside were the answers Mark had been waiting for. Mark opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first few pages. It was all there. Photos, dates, records of phone calls, and text messages. He felt a chill run down his spine as he looked at the images. There was Lisa, smiling and laughing, standing close to a man he'd never seen before. They were together in parking lots, at restaurants, and even outside a hotel. Each photo was like a punch to the gut, confirmation of what he feared but hadn't wanted to believe. The investigator pointed out the timeline, noting how often they'd met and the places they'd gone. Mark barely heard him, his focus locked on the images in front of him. He couldn't look away, even though each picture hurt more than the last. He flipped through the pages, seeing text exchanges that were more than friendly, messages filled with affection, plans, and inside jokes. It was as if he were reading about someone else's life, someone he didn't recognize. One photo in particular stood out, a picture of Lisa leaning against her car, her face close to the other man's, their bodies relaxed and comfortable. She looked happy, the kind of happiness he hadn't seen in a long time. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, realizing that she found that happiness with someone else. Mark's hands shook slightly as he closed the folder. He looked up at the investigator, who gave him a sympathetic nod. There was nothing left to say. The evidence spoke for itself. Mark felt numb, the weight of betrayal settling over him. He thanked the investigator quietly, paying him for his work, and left the cafe in a daze, barely aware of his surroundings as he walked to his car. The drive back home was a blur. His mind replayed the images, the messages, the reality of it all hitting him like waves crashing against the shore. Every mile felt heavier, every memory of his life with Lisa overshadowed by the evidence he'd just seen. He wanted to scream, to cry, to let the pain out, but he felt paralyzed as if he were trapped in some surreal nightmare. When he got home, Mark sat down on the edge of his bed, the folder still clutched in his hands. He thought about all the years he'd spent with Lisa, the moments they'd shared, the dreams they'd built together. He trusted her completely, believed in their bond, in the life they'd built. But now, it all felt like a lie, a carefully crafted illusion that had shattered in an instant. He stayed like that for hours, lost in thought, letting the reality sink in. The hurt was deep, cutting through him in a way he hadn't expected. He'd known things were bad, but seeing the proof, knowing that she'd willingly chosen to be with someone else, it was more than he could bear. The betrayal felt personal, like a betrayal not just of their marriage, but of everything he believed in. In the days that followed, Mark struggled to process what he'd learned. He found himself drifting through life, going through the motions but feeling like a shell of himself. Every little thing reminded him of Lisa, of the life they'd shared and the promises they'd made to each other. The pain was raw, lingering in every quiet moment, in every empty room. Finally, Mark decided he couldn't stay in this limbo any longer. He had to confront her, to hear her side, even if he already knew the truth. He needed to face her, to ask her why, to understand how she could throw away everything they'd built. When Lisa came home that evening, Mark was waiting for her, the folder sitting on the table between them. She froze when she saw it, her face going pale as she realized what it meant. He didn't waste any time. He opened the folder, laying out the photos, the texts, all of it. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the evidence of her betrayal laid bare before her. She tried to explain, stumbling over her words, saying she hadn't meant for things to go this far, that she'd been unhappy, that she felt trapped. She apologized, tears streaming down her face, but her words felt empty and hollow. Mark listened, but he couldn't feel sympathy. All he felt was the weight of her choices, the choices that had destroyed everything they'd once shared. Mark asked her the questions he needed answers to, and she gave him the best explanation she could. But in the end, there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. He told her that he couldn't continue, that their marriage was over. The words came out calmly, but inside, he felt broken, a part of him shattered beyond repair. As he packed his things and prepared to leave, Mark felt a strange sense of relief. The truth, as painful as it was, had set him free. He no longer had to wonder, to question, to feel the crushing weight of doubt. He knew where he stood, and he knew that he couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies. In the days that followed, Mark began the process of moving out, of letting go of the life he'd built with Lisa. It was hard, each memory a reminder of what he'd lost. But he also felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that he could start over, that he could rebuild a life on his own terms. Mark's journey was far from over. The road to healing would be long, filled with moments of doubt and sadness. But he knew that he was stronger than he thought, that he had the resilience to move forward. He'd survived the betrayal, and now he was ready to find peace, to let go of the past, and to create a future free from the weight of mistrust. Mark spent the next few days living with the pain of what he'd uncovered. He moved in with his brother temporarily, creating space between himself and Lisa. He didn't want to confront her out of anger or hurt. He wanted a calm mind when he finally faced her, but every passing day only solidified his decision. He couldn't ignore what he knew now. Finally, after a few days of silence, he asked Lisa to meet him at the house. She looked confused and a bit worried, and he could see the tension in her face when she arrived. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, the place where they'd shared countless meals and conversations. But today, there was only silence as he reached into his bag and placed the envelope on the table in front of her. Lisa stared at it, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for it. She opened it and began to look through the photos and text, her expression shifting from shock to guilt. She didn't try to deny it. There was no point. The evidence was too clear. Mark waited for her to speak, but Lisa sat there in silence, her eyes fixed on the table. Finally, she looked up, her voice shaky. She started with an apology, saying she never meant to hurt him, but to Mark, the words felt hollow, like a weak attempt to cover up the months of deception. He listened as she fumbled through explanations, saying things had gotten complicated, that she'd been feeling distant, and that she didn't know how to fix things. He asked her why she hadn't just told him if she was unhappy. They'd always promised to be honest with each other, no matter how difficult it was. Lisa tried to explain, saying that she'd been confused and didn't know how to confront her feelings. But each excuse only seemed to push Mark further away. As she continued to speak, Mark realized something. He didn't feel anger anymore. The shock and hurt were still there, but the fury he'd expected wasn't. Instead, he felt a strange sense of calm, as though he'd already made his decision long before this conversation. He told her that he couldn't see a way forward for them, not after everything she'd done. Lisa looked devastated, pleading with him to reconsider, saying they could work through this, that they could try counseling or anything he needed. But Mark shook his head. There were some lines, he explained, that once crossed, couldn't be undone. Trust, for him, was one of those lines. He'd built his life around their relationship, around the trust he had in her, and now, that foundation was gone. The conversation went on for hours, with Lisa trying to convince him to give their marriage another chance. She promised that she'd end the affair, that she'd do whatever it took to make things right. But as Mark listened, he realized that he couldn't live with the constant doubt and mistrust that would haunt him if he stayed. He didn't want a life where he'd always be second-guessing, where he'd always wonder if she was being honest. In the end, he told her he was filing for divorce. She broke down, pleading with him, saying that they could rebuild, that he didn't have to leave. But Mark had made up his mind. He couldn't spend the rest of his life wondering if the person next to him was loyal. He needed more than apologies, he needed peace. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and legal meetings. Mark went through the motions, gathering documents, meeting with his lawyer, and taking the steps necessary to finalize the divorce. Lisa fought him at first, trying to hold on to parts of the life they'd built together. She insisted on discussing a financial settlement, spousal support, and even part of his business. But Mark wasn't willing to let her actions go unanswered. As the divorce process began, Mark's lawyer advised him to use the evidence of infidelity to his advantage. It was painful to bring up the details, but he knew he had to protect himself. When they met for mediation, he presented the photos, texts, and other proof of her affair. Lisa's lawyer attempted to negotiate, but Mark's lawyer held firm, emphasizing the breach of trust and betrayal she caused. The judge, seeing the evidence, ruled against her claims for spousal support. The decision was bittersweet for Mark. He didn't take joy in watching her lose, but he knew it was necessary for his own sense of closure. During the final stages of the divorce, Mark moved forward with selling their house. The memories were too deeply embedded in its walls, and he didn't want to stay surrounded by reminders of their broken marriage. He and Lisa split the proceeds, and Mark used his share to start fresh, finding a new place where he could begin rebuilding his life. In the aftermath of their split, Lisa faced consequences of her own. Shortly after they separated, she was arrested for a DUI. The news came as a surprise to Mark, who'd always known her to be responsible. But it seemed that, like him, she was struggling to cope with the fallout of their marriage ending. Despite everything, Mark didn't feel satisfaction in her struggles. He felt a sense of sadness, knowing how much had changed between them, how a life they'd once shared had been shattered by lies and secrets. He loved her deeply and had imagined growing old together, sharing a future that now would never happen. After the divorce was finalized, Mark took time to focus on himself. He leaned on his family, particularly his brother, who'd been his anchor through the process. He threw himself into his business, finding solace in his work and the stability it brought. Slowly, he began to heal, though he knew the scars of betrayal would stay with him for a long time. In the months that followed, Mark thought about taking further legal action, even considering suing Lisa's affair partner for alienation of affection. But ultimately, he decided against it. He realized that he didn't want to be trapped in a cycle of anger and revenge. He wanted to move on, to rebuild his life without letting the bitterness of the past hold him back. It wasn't easy, but each day brought him closer to peace. Mark learned to appreciate the small things again: quiet mornings with coffee, afternoons spent working, evenings spent with friends and family. He discovered a newfound resilience, a strength he didn't know he had. And while he didn't know what the future held, he felt ready to face it on his own terms. The final chapter of his marriage had closed, and though it was a painful ending, Mark knew it was a necessary one. He was free from the lies, the doubts, and the betrayal. And in that freedom, he found a path to healing, to rediscover himself, and to rebuilding a life of honesty and peace. The days following Mark's decision to proceed with the divorce felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. After over 2 decades of life together, he was suddenly sorting through the logistics of separating everything they'd shared. Each step felt heavy, yet he pushed forward, knowing there was no going back now. The initial legal meetings were straightforward, but that soon changed. Lisa wanted more than just a fair split. She argued that she deserved spousal support and part ownership of Mark's vending machine business. It was a blow he hadn't expected. Mark had built that business from the ground up. It had been his vision, his hard work, and his long hours. He couldn't imagine giving up a part of it, especially to someone who'd broken his trust so deeply. Their lawyers arranged for a mediation session, a day Mark dreaded. He entered the mediation room with his attorney, feeling the wave of emotions: anger, betrayal, but also a strange sense of finality. Lisa sat across from him, avoiding his eyes. Her lawyer spoke on her behalf, laying out her requests and listing out what she felt she was entitled to after their long marriage. When his lawyer presented the evidence of her infidelity, Lisa's demeanor changed. She looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment. It was one thing to deal with the fallout in private, but here, in front of strangers and legal representatives, the reality of her actions was on full display. The photos, the text, the documented meetings. Everything was laid out in black and white. Mark could see the impact it had on her, but he stayed silent, holding his ground. The mediator tried to keep things civil, reminding both parties of their shared history and the benefits of compromise. But as the hours passed, the tone grew tenser. Lisa's lawyer pressed for a financial settlement, but Mark's attorney countered with the clear evidence of her affair. The judge would not look favorably on a request for support from someone whose actions had led to the end of the marriage. Finally, after hours of back and forth, the mediator suggested a compromise. Lisa would receive a share of the assets they'd built together, but no claim to the business. Mark's lawyer agreed, knowing this would protect what he'd worked so hard for, and Lisa's attorney reluctantly accepted. The next few days were filled with paperwork, signatures, and final arrangements. Mark found it surreal, seeing the life he'd built with Lisa reduced to lines on paper, itemized lists of possessions, and accounts to be divided. The memories they shared had been replaced by legal jargon and negotiations, each decision marking the end of something he'd once cherished. Amidst the legal process, Mark began the painful task of packing up their home. Every item he picked up felt like a piece of their shared past. There were photos of vacations, gifts from anniversaries, and little keepsakes from holidays and birthdays. Each one was a reminder of what they'd once had, a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. He packed his belongings, carefully boxing up what was his, leaving Lisa's things untouched. She had agreed to take what she wanted, and the rest they would donate or sell. The house itself had to go. It held too many memories, and Mark knew he couldn't start fresh while living there. In the middle of all this, Mark got a call he wasn't expecting. Lisa had been arrested for a DUI. It was a shock, something completely out of character for her. Despite everything that had happened between them, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't the woman he'd known for over 20 years, the woman he'd once dreamed of spending his life with. It was as if the person she'd become was a stranger. Mark debated whether to reach out to her, but ultimately decided against it. He'd made his choice, and she would have to face the consequences of her actions alone. It was a harsh realization, but he understood that this was part of the process of letting go. They'd both made choices, and now they were both dealing with the fallout. As the divorce moved toward its conclusion, Mark found himself in a strange limbo. He was free, legally untethered from Lisa, but emotionally, the wounds were still raw. He spent time with his brother, who provided a steady presence through the darkest days, and threw himself into his business, finding solace in the familiar routine of work. Friends reached out, offering their support, but Mark found it difficult to talk about what he was going through. The shame, the hurt, and the sense of betrayal were all too fresh. He wanted to move on, but he knew that healing wouldn't be quick or easy. In the weeks after the divorce, Mark started attending a local support group for those going through separation and divorce. He wasn't sure if it was for him, but he figured it was worth a try. The group was filled with people from all walks of life, each with their own stories of heartbreak and resilience. Sitting in that room, listening to others share their experiences, Mark felt a sense of connection. He wasn't alone in his pain, and slowly, he found comfort in knowing that others had survived similar struggles. One evening, after a particularly intense group session, Mark decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. He passed by familiar landmarks and places he and Lisa used to visit together. The park where they'd once spent lazy Sunday afternoons, the coffee shop where they'd had their first date, the restaurant where they'd celebrated their anniversaries. Each place held memories, but now they felt distant, like remnants of a life he'd left behind. In time, Mark began to create new routines. He joined the gym, something he'd been putting off for years, and started reconnecting with old friends. He took up reading again, a hobby he'd once loved but had let go of over the years. Slowly, he began to reclaim parts of himself that had been lost in the daily grind of marriage and work. His business became a focus, a place where he could pour his energy and rebuild his confidence. He hired new employees, expanded his operations, and found a renewed sense of purpose. It was a way to remind himself of what he was capable of, that he could still build something meaningful on his own. Months passed, and though the pain was still there, it began to fade. Mark realized that the love he once felt for Lisa had transformed. It wasn't the passionate, all-consuming love of their early years, nor was it the quiet companionship they'd shared in the middle years. Now it was something else, a distant respect for the memories they created, tempered by the knowledge of how it had ended. There were moments of regret, times when he'd wonder if he could have done something differently. But each time he reminded himself that he had done his best, that he had given his all to the relationship. He couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future, and he was determined to build a life he could be proud of. In the final stage of healing, Mark reached out to a therapist. He wanted to understand his own role in the breakdown of his marriage, not to blame himself, but to learn and grow. The therapist helped him unpack years of emotions, guiding him to see the patterns and decisions that had led to where he was now. It was a difficult process, but it gave him a sense of closure. One evening, sitting in his new apartment, Mark looked out at the city lights and felt a quiet peace settle over him. He was no longer defined by the hurt or the betrayal. He was just Mark, a man who had loved deeply, who had been hurt, but who had also found the strength to move on. He knew he would carry the lessons of this experience with him, and that he would be more cautious with his heart in the future. But he also knew that he was ready to open himself up to life again, to find happiness on his own terms. And as he sat there, in the stillness of his new life, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As the months slipped by, Mark began to settle into his new life. Each day felt like a small step forward, a chance to put a little more distance between himself and the past. He had a new apartment, a modest space with simple furnishings that reflected his new beginning. It was smaller than the house he'd shared with Lisa, but it felt like his. Here, he could finally let go of the weight he'd carried. Mark poured himself into his work, expanding his vending machine business with a sense of purpose. He hired a few new employees and started exploring new locations to set up his machines. The process was rewarding, not just financially, but personally. Each new deal and each client meeting reminded him of what he was capable of. The business became a source of stability and pride, and he found himself rediscovering his passion for it. Outside of work, he also took steps to reconnect with the world around him. He joined a gym and began working out regularly, finding a surprising sense of relief in the routine. Physical exercise became a way to clear his mind and let go of the thoughts that sometimes still haunted him. He found peace in the movement, the feeling of pushing himself and seeing his progress each week. It wasn't just about the physical aspect. Going to the gym also connected him with others. He started chatting with a few regulars, getting to know people who didn't know anything about his past, who saw him as just Mark. Those small conversations felt refreshing, like little glimpses into a life free from the shadow of betrayal. He also began reaching out to old friends he hadn't seen in years. There were people he lost touch with over the course of his marriage, friends who had once been close but had drifted away as life got busier. To his surprise, they welcomed him back without hesitation, inviting him to dinners, game nights, and weekend gatherings. Being around familiar faces reminded him of who he was before everything fell apart, and he started to feel a sense of belonging again. One weekend, his brother invited him on a fishing trip, a tradition they'd shared when they were younger. They spent hours by the lake, casting lines and sharing stories. It was a quiet, comforting escape from the noise of daily life, and it gave Mark a chance to reflect. Sitting there by the water, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a peace he hadn't known in a long time. His brother, always supportive, reminded him that he wasn't defined by his past and that he had the power to shape his future. As he reconnected with friends and family, Mark found that his perspective on relationships was changing. He began to appreciate the simple connections in life, the friendships that didn't come with expectations or complications. These bonds, he realized, were as valuable as any romantic relationship. For the first time in years, he felt fulfilled without needing someone else to complete him. He was enough on his own. In the evenings, when he returned to his quiet apartment, he allowed himself moments of reflection. He would sit by the window, looking out at the city lights, thinking back on his journey. The memories of Lisa and their marriage still lingered, but they no longer held the same sting. He remembered the good times, the laughter they'd shared, and he chose to keep those memories close, letting go of the bitterness. One day, Mark received a letter from Lisa. She'd written to apologize, to explain her side of things, and to wish him well. Reading her words stirred up old emotions, but he realized that he no longer felt anger or resentment. He had moved past those feelings, reaching a place of acceptance. He didn't respond to the letter. He felt that some things were better left in the past, but he was grateful for the closure it offered, the final acknowledgement that their chapter had ended. In his personal life, Mark remained single, but he didn't close himself off from the idea of finding love again. He knew that someday he might meet someone who could appreciate him for who he was, scars and all. But for now, he was content focusing on himself, enjoying the freedom and independence he'd gained. The thought of dating no longer filled him with dread or pressure. It was simply another possibility for the future, something he could explore when he felt ready. He took up new hobbies, things he'd always wanted to try but had put off for various reasons. He learned how to cook, experimenting with different recipes and flavors. Cooking became a new passion, a way for him to create something for himself, to fill his home with warmth and comfort. He even took a class on weekends, meeting others who shared his enthusiasm. The kitchen, once a place of shared meals and memories, became his personal retreat, a space where he could be creative and enjoy the simple pleasure of a good meal. Mark also spent time traveling, visiting places he always dreamed of seeing. He went to the mountains, breathing in the crisp air and hiking trails he'd only ever seen in pictures. He spent a weekend by the ocean, letting the sound of the waves wash over him, feeling a sense of calm that reminded him of his childhood. Each trip brought him closer to himself, helping him rediscover the joy of solitude, of being content with his own company. One evening, as he was looking through old photos, Mark found a picture of himself from years ago, smiling and carefree. It was a reminder of the man he used to be before life had taken him through so many twists and turns. At that moment, he realized that he hadn't lost himself after all. He'd simply been hidden under the layers of responsibilities, expectations, and heartbreak. Now he felt like he was finally coming back to that person, someone who was whole and happy on his own. With each passing day, Mark grew stronger and more resilient. He learned to set boundaries, prioritize his own well-being, and surround himself with people who respected and supported him. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he felt ready to face them, armed with the lessons he'd gained from his journey. As the seasons changed, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His business was thriving, his friendships were stronger than ever, and he'd built a life that was filled with meaning and joy. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. He was at peace with himself, content with the life he'd rebuilt. Mark's journey had taken him through heartbreak, anger, and sadness, but it had also led him to a place of strength and self-acceptance. He'd come to understand that life wasn't about holding on to the past, but about embracing the possibilities of the future. He was ready for whatever lay ahead, confident in the knowledge that he could handle it, no matter what. In the end, Mark had found his resolution. He had moved on, not by forgetting, but by choosing to remember in a way that brought him peace. He knew he carried the memories of his marriage with him, but they no longer defined him. He was simply Mark, a man who had faced life's challenges and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. And as he looked out at the world, he felt a quiet, steady hope rise within him, a hope that reminded him that, even after everything, he was free. As Mark continued building his new life, he found himself reflecting on the journey he'd been through. The pain of betrayal, the heartache of loss, and the challenges of starting over, all of it had shaped him in ways he never imagined. He realized that while the experience had been painful, it had also taught him invaluable lessons about resilience, trust, and the importance of self-worth. One of the biggest lessons Mark learned was the value of trusting his instincts. Looking back, he could see the signs that had been there all along, the subtle changes in Lisa's behavior, the small lies that seemed harmless at first. He'd ignored his gut feelings, wanting to believe in the person he loved, hoping for the best even when things didn't add up. But now he understood the importance of listening to those inner warnings. They weren't about paranoia or distrust. They were about protecting himself and recognizing when something fell off. Trust, he realized, was not just something given freely. It was something earned over time and maintained through consistent actions. He trusted Lisa deeply, believing their bond was unbreakable, but he now understood that trust required ongoing effort from both sides. It wasn't enough to simply love someone. There had to be honesty, respect, and a commitment to transparency. Without those elements, even the strongest relationships could crumble. Mark also came to see the importance of self-worth. For years, he defined himself by his relationship, measuring his happiness through his role as a husband. He'd invested so much of himself into making Lisa happy, often putting her needs above his own. But through the journey of rebuilding, he learned to value himself as an individual, not just as someone's partner. He realized that his happiness wasn't dependent on anyone else, that he deserved to be valued and respected simply for who he was. This realization changed his outlook on relationships. If he ever chose to love again, he'd make sure it was with someone who respected his boundaries, someone who valued honesty as much as he did. He'd no longer sacrifice his self-respect for the sake of peace. His worth was no longer tied to someone else's acceptance, and that freedom was empowering. Another lesson that stayed with him was the power of resilience. When everything first fell apart, he felt lost, as if he'd been stripped of his identity. But step by step, he had rebuilt his life. Each setback had taught him something new, and each challenge had strengthened him. Mark understood now that resilience wasn't about being unaffected by pain. It was about moving forward despite it. It was about choosing to keep going, even when every part of him wanted to give up. There were days when he still struggled, moments when memories of the past would surface, bringing with them a pang of sadness. But he learned to accept these moments as part of his healing process. He didn't need to erase the past or pretend it hadn't happened. Instead, he learned to view his past as a chapter in his life, one that had shaped him but didn't define him. He could acknowledge the pain while also appreciating the strength he gained from it. Mark found that gratitude played a crucial role in his healing. Despite the betrayal, he was grateful for the good times he'd shared with Lisa, for the love they'd once had. He wasn't bitter. He didn't hold on to anger. Instead, he chose to focus on the lessons and let go of the rest. He knew that clinging to resentment would only weigh him down, and he was ready to move forward with an open heart and mind. Through his reflections, Mark also realized the importance of forgiveness. But forgiveness, he learned, wasn't about condoning what had happened or letting Lisa off the hook. It was about freeing himself from the pain that lingered. Forgiveness, he discovered, was an internal process, a way of letting go of the hurt so he could heal fully. He didn't need to forgive her for her sake. He did it for his own peace. Forgiving Lisa was a gradual process. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't a simple decision. But as he worked through his emotions, he began to feel lighter. He no longer carried the bitterness or resentment. Instead, he was able to view the experience with acceptance, seeing it as a part of his journey rather than a burden he had to bear. One evening, while journaling, Mark wrote down a list of the things he'd gained through this experience. He noted the resilience he'd built, the confidence he'd found, and the self-respect he'd reclaimed. He realized that he'd become a better version of himself, a man who could face life's challenges head-on, who could rebuild and find happiness on his own terms. He had also learned the value of setting boundaries. In the past, he'd often sacrificed his own needs for the sake of keeping the peace, avoiding confrontation, and prioritizing the relationship above all else. But now he understood the importance of respecting his own limits. He wasn't willing to let anyone cross his boundaries, even if it meant having difficult conversations or making tough decisions. This newfound clarity extended to every area of his life. In his friendships, he became more selective, surrounding himself with people who uplifted and supported him. He no longer felt the need to please everyone or to be liked by everyone. He valued quality over quantity, choosing to invest his time in people who genuinely cared about him. He also found himself more willing to try new things. The journey had shown him that life was too short to hold back, too precious to live in fear. He explored new hobbies, embraced new experiences, and started saying yes to opportunities that once intimidated him. He was no longer content to live within the safe confines of his comfort zone. Instead, he wanted to experience all that life had to offer, to live fully and fearlessly. Through his reflections, Mark understood that life wasn't about avoiding pain, but about growing through it. The experience had taught him that he was stronger than he'd ever imagined, and that he had the resilience to face whatever challenges came his way. He had discovered a depth of courage within himself, a courage that carried him forward even when the path was uncertain. As he looked to the future, Mark felt a sense of excitement. He knew that he was a different person now, someone who had walked through the fire and come out stronger. He was no longer haunted by the past, no longer weighed down by the pain. Instead, he was filled with a sense of purpose, a desire to make the most of his life, and to live in a way that honored his journey. In those quiet moments, Mark found peace. He knew he would carry the lessons he learned with him, that he would move forward with a deeper understanding of himself and a newfound respect for his own strength. He wasn't afraid of the future. He welcomed it, ready to embrace whatever came his way. His journey had taught him that love wasn't just about finding someone else. It was about finding himself, about understanding his own worth, and about embracing life with an open heart. He was ready to live fully, to face each day with courage, and to find happiness on his own terms. And as he reflected on all he had learned, Mark felt a profound gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the person he had become. He knew that life would continue to bring challenges, but he was ready, confident in the strength he had gained and the peace he had found within himself. Mark's story wasn't about the pain of betrayal. It was about the power of resilience, the courage to rebuild, and the beauty of finding peace within. And with that understanding, he looked forward to the future, knowing that he was truly free. Mark's story is one of heartbreak, resilience, and rediscovery. What began as a painful chapter in his life ultimately became a journey of growth and strength. The betrayal he faced was one of the deepest wounds he'd ever endured. But in the end, it wasn't the betrayal that defined him. it was his response to it. After months of hurt, confusion, and self-doubt, Mark found his way back to himself. He learned to embrace life on his own terms and to build a foundation of trust within himself. Through each small step, he found a new sense of purpose, creating a life that was peaceful, authentic, and filled with hope. It wasn't an easy journey, but with each challenge he faced, he grew stronger. For anyone who's been through a similar experience, know that you're not alone. Heartbreak is one of life's hardest challenges, but it can also be a powerful teacher. The lessons aren't always easy, and the path forward may feel uncertain, but with patience and self-compassion, healing is possible. Like Mark, you can find the strength to rebuild, to redefine what happiness looks like for you. If you found Mark's journey inspiring, relatable, or simply meaningful, please consider showing your support by liking this video. And if you're interested in more stories like this, stories of resilience, growth, and real-life challenges, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Don't forget to leave a comment below and share your thoughts or experiences. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to keep going. Thank you for being here with us on this journey. Remember, every ending is a new beginning, and no matter how dark things may seem, there's always a path forward.